Trigger warning. This podcast contains potentially triggering subject matter and topics of physical, mental, sexual, and substance abuse.
Hi, and welcome back to True North in a Podcast. We're your hosts, Michelle
And Rashane.
In this episode, we're talking about residential schools, a 3-part podcast series from Historica Canada on the history and legacy of residential schools. More specifically, Episode 3, Inuit Experiences in Residential Schools.
Here today we have Hero, Dwight, and Chelsea. Now, have you guys ever heard of Indian residential schools before?
I grew up in Canada, so in the Saskatchewan school system, we spent a lot of time talking about residential schools, but we never took time to learn about the Inuit experience at the residential schools.
Right. It's kind of like the polar opposite for me. I am an international student. I'm from India, so none of the history of Canada was like shared with us in our school system, and of course, because it's a different country, so I personally never got to know about it, educate myself about it until I came to Canada in 2019. And it's still an ongoing process for me to just understand what it's actually about. And it's such a vast topic that it's kind of hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with Hero. I also grew up in Toronto in Canada, and I learned about it a little bit in elementary school and a tiny bit more in high school, but if I'm honest, I don't actually know too much about residential schools.
Wow, I actually resonate with Dwight because I'm also an international student. I'm from Jamaica, not India, but they don't teach that in our school system either. I was actually very surprised to hear about it when I came to Canada, and I didn't even hear about it when I came in 2019, but in 2021. So Michelle, I'm hoping that you could help me. What do you know about residential schools? You're from Canada, you've been here.
Yeah, growing up in Canada, it is somewhat incorporated into our school system. I started learning about residential schools myself in around grade 4 and grade 5, and we just kind of learned the same regurgitated facts every year up until maybe grade 10, which is when I stopped taking history after that. So that's ultimately why I took this True North course, because I had an interest in it. Indian residential schools were mostly established by the Christian churches, but it wasn't until 1899 that these schools began to receive federal funding from the government of Canada. The parents of these children that were attending the residential schools were not consulted about whether their kids got to go to these schools or not, and really had no say in the matter. Sometimes the children would not see their families for as long as 10 months, in some cases years.
Okay, so this is very weird to me, Michelle, because I remember going to school. My mom and dad were there every day, permission slips to go places. But this doesn't sound like school to me. It sounds almost like prison, like they're being taken away. And it's kind of rough to hear. But then, all right, so if the parents aren't involved, they're not really given any say in the matter. How do they get to school? What is that process like? How does it look, them arriving to these schools?
Upon arriving at the residential schools, students were processed almost like prisoners. Children would arrive, get into lineups where they'd cut off the bulk of their hair. After putting the children through delousing, then they would hit the showers, where they were scrubbed down. Then they were sent into another lineup for their clothes. When a child arrived at Grolier Hall, they were first segregated according to religion, next according to gender. But then they were further separated by junior and senior, and you were lucky if you got to stay with your younger sibling, like sisters, for example, but most often that wasn't the case.
Well, when I hear this, I think of in today's society, how Indigenous kids are still being stripped away from their culture and families. Majority of the adopted community in Canada is part of the Indigenous population, and I myself am one of those kids, so I have been stripped from my culture, and it's sad because I don't actually know much about it today. So yeah, when I hear that, I can relate to it in a very small way, obviously not at the full extent of those kids, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so as an outsider, quote unquote, it's kind of heartbreaking for me to realize that how children from young age were exposed to such a crude and a very harsh environment of them being separated to from their parents, from their siblings, from their identity. Like I remember us discussing in class about this photo that our teacher showed us about Thomas Kiesik, right, and how how they had sort of like forged his entire identity, like from A to B, from tip to toe. Everything about him was based on what he was going through, or like how he was being conditioned by the residential schools. And I guess as you're saying about how adoption and everything is, it kind of relates to me in that context. It's like how like remnants of the whole past of the residential school system have impacted the present and the future generations as well.
Yeah, and even like reasons why kids are being adopted today are valid reasons, but it's through like the conditioning of these bad habits and like alcoholism, abuse. Like it's hard to stray away from that when that's all you've ever known.
Students were then given uniforms, which were often Southern clothing. For some, this was the first time they had ever worn non-traditional clothes, like the first time they've ever seen shoes or jeans, because they didn't wear that traditionally in their culture. These Indigenous children were encouraged to mingle with the white kids to become more like them, essentially.
I mean, that's like, firstly, worldwide that is still going on, like in terms of all these cultures of people that have either been taken from their homes or their homes have been invaded by whoever. They always kind of start with stripping you of who you are, both mentally, spiritually, and then now physically with clothes. So like, for example, in the slave trade, when people are brought from Africa, they're not wearing the same stuff that they would wear. They're now wearing like corsets and button-up shirts and jackets because that is what the white man that took them is wearing. So it's just crazy. And like, especially right now in 2023, I feel like fashion is what defines us. It kind of gives you like who you are and what your culture is. And even that word culture, like, how you feeling about that, Hero?
Yeah, like I feel like a lot of identity nowadays is how you present yourself, especially in Canada, maybe Toronto specifically.
Yeah.
It's a place of like diversity, but everyone is sometimes just like falling into a trap of not expressing yourself.
Exactly.
And it's very important to show off yourself physically, and how you present yourself is such a strong part of your identity, and being stripped of that at such a young age, and you don't even get to learn what it is that
you don't even know what your style is.
Exactly.
Like I'm 23. I'm just kind of figuring out what my style is right now. You know what I mean? Some white shoes, nice pants and things. But like, imagine not having that at all. Like from the age of 5 or 6 or even younger, they're putting you in like something that's very uncomfortable, very not like you. I don't like it at all, bro.
Yeah, something that's not too talked about is how systemic it is. Things like residential schools and the 60s scoop all contribute to the fact that Indigenous people are at a disadvantage. They're taken away from their culture. They're stripped of so much of their identity. The assimilation is just brutal to hear about, and the effects are still being felt today.
In the third episode of the Historica Canada Residential Schools podcast, they mainly focus on the 3 Dindiju concepts of strength. The first one is Ta'ai, which means ancestral strength. So these students would have a very deep connection to their ancestors, their families, and their lands. They would have prayed to their ancestors or secretly continue to talk their Indigenous languages to themselves in their head or even to a friend. These children were forced to speak English and would be punished if they were caught speaking their own languages. They were told to forget about their culture, forget their language, and forget about their Inuit spirituality. And eventually the determination to hang on to their language was broken.
There is a quote from PETA where he says, "The year 1958, whether I knew anything about it at the time or not, was the beginning of the end of my own culture and my own language and my own Inuit spirituality." Hearing a personal account of knowing exactly when someone lost their culture is brutal to hear. The process of assimilation is always described as a long and gradual one, but putting a year on it makes it feel so real.
I think it's like very important to preserve ancestral strength, traditions, and the values which are being sort of like shared, passed upon like generation to generation. For the most part, I remember like in school, because I studied in a convent school in India, and even though we had to sort of like resonate to the values and beliefs which the school had taught us, we were still subjected to reflect on our traditions, on our religion, on like respective religions because of the diversity, and also at the same time we were sort of instilled into this feeling of like understanding our values and tradition, and that I guess to this date it kind of has enforced a deep sense of connection on like within me from my roots, from my ancestors, from my tradition. And it's very important for any person throughout their upbringing to connect and to resonate with what their previous generations have done for them and for the future generations as well. So yeah, I completely resonate with you on that.
The second Dindiju concept is vitai, meaning personal strength. These students did whatever they had to in order to survive. Students might try to run away, or they would try to steal from the garden, or even hunt animals such as rabbits to try and supplement their diets. They might have secretly written letters home in their indigenous languages. It took a remarkable amount of personal strength to live through and survive these tragic experiences. Education employees would often host parties in their homes and invite senior students who were granted more freedom, and they would get them intoxicated and sexually assault them, particularly the girls. These students would later bury themselves in vices such as alcohol to hide from the shame that they endured at the hands of the church.
As a woman hearing this, it really saddens me because even today, I know at least 5 girls who have experienced some form of sexual assault, and it's still very prevalent in society today. And I actually had a friend. She moved up to Alberta, and she worked with I think it was called. It was through this company called Outland, and they work with young Indigenous youth. And the stories that she told me, and it was just so heartbreaking what things like that can do to a person, and how it's passed down through generations, and it's something very difficult to heal or make sense of.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely, the generational trauma is so real because of what happened in the residential schools, and because that trauma is passed down to the next generation, because they hear all these stories that of the horrible things that happened to their family members. Then they're not offered as many like opportunities because of the mental health impacts. Maybe they've turned to like vices like alcohol and drugs, and so then they just aren't able to do like
Yeah. And also another point that came to my mind was they got the older girls who wanted more freedom, and it sounds like it was an exchange. So I'll give you more freedom if you give me this. And yeah, you still see that today, maybe not in like sexual favors, but there is always like that exchange of like a woman having to give somebody something in order to get more freedom or to like attain more rights.
Yeah, very transactional relationships in this day and age. The third Dindiju concept is gutai, which means communal or collective strength. So they had strength in their numbers. In the late 1990s, a former student of Grolier Hall came forward with allegations of abuse that had happened to him at the residence. This ultimately led to an investigation interviewing over 400 former students from Grolier Hall and resulted in a class action lawsuit that helped to inform the process of how Truth and Reconciliation Commission would come together and would compensate former students, and also helped inform the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement.
Yeah, so like community in most cultures is very, prominent. Like I grew up with a saying from Jamaica, like it takes a village to grow a child. So it's not surprising to me that this concept is strongly about just people coming together and about unity. That's how I grew up. I don't know how I would feel or how I would even think if I didn't have like a communities of like aunties and uncles and family friends that just kind of surrounded me and made sure that I was okay. So like to know that someone was treated unfairly, abused, it took 400 interviews to even get that settlement case done. Like that's 400. That's 400 strong aunties, uncles, nieces, nephews, brothers, and sisters just coming together, trying to unite to finally make an end or just to have any action on something that has been going on for so long. So, like, here, I don't know how you feel about community. Like, what is that for you?
Yeah. Something that strikes me with that, they needed 400 cases.
Like two voices wasn't enough?
Yeah, it's a very sad thing to hear that the strength in numbers, because for me, strength in numbers can be way less than 400. For me, like in elementary school, like I don't know, maybe you didn't feel this, but like just getting bullied, like people of color just got bullied. It was just, elementary school, right? And I ended up being friends with more people of color because you related, and we created a little community, and it's just a small pocket of us, but in our strength in numbers, right?
Exactly.
So, with this case, you needed 400. Why wasn't 2 enough, right?
Exactly, man. Exactly. But then that even shows their fortitude and strength, because, like, if you see 50 people go up and that's not enough for 400 people to decide that this is enough, this is it, that's a community coming together. Even if they don't know who is being abused, it's one of our own. And, like, that sense of family is what keeps people together all the time. So, like, this is a concept of my own strength. So I resonate deeply with this one.
Exactly. Like, how many people have to suffer before we can break this pattern of extreme neglect and disregard?
This podcast, along with archival photos, let us learn from those who have actually experienced these horrific events. This multi-part series gives Indigenous peoples a voice and offers us education around their culture and the dingy zoo concepts of strength that we would not have otherwise learned about. This bundle ultimately points out that there is still a lot of work to be done in the truth and reconciliation process.
If you or someone you know are in need of immediate support, here are some resources provided in the Residential Schools podcast at the end of Episode 3. National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419. The Hope for Wellness Helpline at 1-855-242-3310. Phone services available in Cree, Ojibwe, Inuktitut, French, and English. The Hope for Wellness helpline also offers online support services at hopeforwellness.ca. Kids Help Phone, 1-800-668-6868.
This podcast would not be possible without our inspiration and our sponsor, Mo, which we appreciate dearly. Through her love and admiration for the true north and teaching us the right way, now we have come to love how she teaches a class and even projects like this. So, thank you, Mo. We appreciate you. This is from the True North Podcast. Have a great day.